So just to check, did anyone have questions on just that first piece about research?
Could you say a little more about co-location? What is that whole concept? What does that look like in practice?
So, well, David is going to talk about that from a pace perspective of delivery of services. I think part of the challenge is that, so if you look at the Walmart, when we said, within 10 miles, is to make service delivery efficient to keep people in housing settings, is that how do you get support to all these different locations? And so it's much more efficient and Jennifer, you can talk about this too, is that for service, if you need somebody to come in to do support, and it can be everything from, cleaning to full care management, is that there's an efficiency of having people in a centralized geography versus spending, travel time from one location to another. And that is a challenge in particularly the more rural, because of how do you get services out to a very scattered geography, and where there then can be even exponential isolation issues. And we know that one of the greatest challenges is workforce.
Just one other up on that. In Pennsylvania, most of you, I know there's some folks from outside of Pennsylvania. How many from Pennsylvania right now? So a good portion of the room. So
the way Medicare and Medicaid are setting up right now, you're going to hear about PACE and Life in Pennsylvania, which is an opportunity for those that have skilled nursing requirements. But in Pennsylvania right now, they're implementing community health choices. Everybody's heard that. That's for your dual eligible sisters. And what we find in congregations, somewhere between 80 and 90% of sisters qualify. This is the first time in Pennsylvania you're going to have an integrated service delivery program. It's still very much a work in progress. It was implemented in Pittsburgh in January. It comes to Philadelphia January 1, 2019. And there's opportunity in there in working with the insurance companies. I've been in their offices. They're looking to work with groups, particularly larger groups, but you can get very creative with the insurance companies right now in creating programs for your sisters using those dual eligible community health choices programs that are going to be coming to Philadelphia January 1. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just to give you that update. And if you hadn't heard about it, let's talk during lunch, because there really is some opportunity there.
Any other questions from earlier, the research? So some of the questions that when we had asked of what, after the prayer of the vital living question that you're holding that most concerns or challenges you, I'll just share a couple that are relevant to this next session. How to help sisters and myself imagine a new way of living that is more vital and hopeful. How do we keep balance between our work, ministry, health relationships, spiritual lives, and our interests as we age and go through different phases of our lives? How to remain rooted in who we are called to be as we deal with real life issues of today and in the future. How do we foster an environment of mission-oriented living and ministry? What is the magical combination of components that make up vital life and transform us from medical model to wellness? So a couple of things on that is that, one, we know of vital as it's all very personal and different, much like the adjectives you use to describe yourself. I think that there has been very limited studies on women religious and their health. But of those couple studies that have been done, and they're small in number, so this is not necessarily representative research, but that many have been, the finding of one study was that, sisters are so used to of giving themselves to their ministries, they don't often take care of their own health. So they don't do basic preventative health, and so that is a challenge, especially as they need support. So that piece of it, and that how I think it's difficult and certainly later today, as some others will share, is that it's difficult for leadership because, you're the same community. It's like, coaching your family. I mean, I just went through this family dynamic of I know nothing. And, my brother who's an architect and the other one who's a nomad are gonna pick oncologists and, hospice programs and be the advisors. So that part of the dynamic is difficult because, it's often you're the last people somebody wants to share anything with. And that you have already predetermined what you are going to do with my life, and I'm going to fight it. And so, that is a piece. And I think that how do we meet members where they are? And so, and many of you have your own stories, but this is an ongoing, thing that we have to, that has to keep evolving. And so, in our process, we do a lot of education and engagement and making sure their voices are heard. And the other side, though, is when we look at what programs and services or housing or whatever that may be that can be part of a congregational plan, one of the things that's often missing is really that focus on the individual. Because the reality is insurance programs, government programs are all very prescripted and they're not usually the easiest, let's change this up kind of thing. So that, what really is missing, and what we've known this for a long time, and is how do we overlay and come to dealing one-on-one with our sisters and with every individual from that coaching mindset. So, and that wellness, like I'm a certified wellness coach, but that's not on looking at an older demographic. It's much more on, in general kind of wellness. So really integrating that of how do we use that coaching and all the stuff of integral coaching that we know that's been successful and is multi-generational, and interweave that and overlay that as we look at care and services and supports and living and housing. There was just an article in Forbes that was on Karen Sands, so I just called her up and said, I am completely intrigued by what you do. Can I talk to you? So she helped me build this. We had talked about would she come and speak, but I decided in like 3 weeks there was not enough time from when I read the article and started connecting with her to explain to her all the nuances of religious life to make it relevant for you. So, but she really helped, and I think that her perspective and what she offers. So, she's a gerofuturist. She's really was involved with conscious aging and kind of a coaching pioneer. And so one of the things that she had talked about, was how do we be visionary pathfinders? And she's like, and what is that golden thread of looking at this? Go ahead. really, she said, as leaders, first they have to do, and we all have to think about our own awareness as we think about vital living and where we are. So what do we really believe? And so, unless the individual leaders have done their work, it's not going to be successful as you take it to members. So are you personally committed? Do you have a lot of doubts on this? Well, then first, looking at what those are so those can be brought forward. Are you really prepared to be a role model of vital living? And what are your biases? And what are the myths? So the myths, and this is from a recently published article, and there's a book on called When I Need Help, I'll Let You Know. And nobody in this room wrote it. But myth number one is, really, I'll let you know when I need help. That's not the way it works, is that most of us don't know when we need help. And it goes back to that right housing and, not aging in place, but really having that right housing and having the supports available if and when you need them. And so most of us, something happens that's unannounced, unexpected, and then we need help. And it can be for an interim amount of time or it can be permanent. So we talked about this, I'm staying here till we die. It could be unsafe. So I'm sure you have stories, sisters who have fallen downstairs, who have had other limiting things because of the environment that really hasn't been safe. And sisters who are driving, who probably it's not safe to have them drive. That used to be when there were still sisters in the, transportation, who they'd say, well, we'll have so-and-so pick you up at the airport. I said that could be like an entire book I could write about just, my near-death experiences. And so then when I'm old and ill, when I really need help, then you, the leadership, or the sisters I live with, or my family, or my friends, many of who are all the same age, they will take care of me. And so thinking about that of, my sister, well, how old is your sister? If you're 96 and she's 98, have we really thought about that? So that part, again, of how do we get really and work with individuals to think about their story and what's important. So thinking about that, not only our story, but that how does it create that powerful act for our future? And so, and letting that story unfold so that what I say is important, I am working through that so I can have the future that I want. And so I am an outside girl. I'm a nature girl, outside girl. I would be the most miserable nursing home resident if I shared a room and was on the bathroom side. I mean, I really, would be just, behaviors probably would be off the chart. And I would be miserable. And so I know that. And I know, so those things of thinking about what does that really mean is going through those deeper things and really doing that introspection. But we can't do it ourselves. And that's really where that coaching piece of having an outsider who's trained in this help me look deeper and pose that. And they're not doing it for me. Because really, remember, the assessment is you're going to tell us everything that, I'm going to ask you these questions, I'm going to identify what's wrong with you and what you need, and then I'm going to come back, and this is how you're going to enroll in this plan, and that's the answer. And so that piece of, and we can't do this all at once. It's an evolution. Coaching is an evolution. So this is my first priority. Maybe if I address stress in my life, then I really could do other things like, slow down. So for me, but that, how do we think about how do we have to change our stories? So, as part of education in any change initiative, it is sharing the facts. I am sure everybody in this room has shared the data of your demographics, the reality of your aging, the reality of there are not sisters to continue to take care of sisters, to drive them to appointments, to accompany sisters to the ER, to do things that, other sisters really haven't asked, but assume that I can't do my laundry anymore. So, Gwen is going to do my laundry, whoever that may be, but I really never talked to Gwen about this. So that you presented the facts, but that it's really, that doesn't make them personal. And so that really is that coaching piece of how do we create the power of personal stories. So that gives, individually, it really creates that perspective that facts can't. So it's helping them individuate and making those personal so that they can be inspirational. And, oftentimes I think it's hard to talk about ourselves, that coaching piece of really asking those open questions to help people think about and express themselves in ways they may have not articulated, to others, and really thinking about it in appropriate ways. So, if you look at kind of coaching profiles, and that was one of the things that Karen and I did of, this is this personality. So I'm fiercely independent. I can do everything. I mean, I was born the first, my mother would tell you by the time I was 3, I could do everything myself. She's like, the only time you would let anyone help you was when you were sick. So I'm fiercely independent. I can do it all myself. I don't need, So that persona of what does that mean as I need support, of helping through coaching understand that, and having somebody who has no really skin in the game. They are not personally woven into my life. They're just there. Really be that deep listener and not having the answer, just helping ask the questions so I can come to that. And respecting, that changing need. But part of that is through asking those questions of, have you thought about this? What would you do? And honoring what's truly important to them. So oftentimes with sisters and that question about ministry is they'd say their ministry is most important to them. And the reality is many of your sisters and all of you have been missioned all over the place. Our ministry changes lots of times, but I think as we age, it becomes this ministry is. And that, are they really holding on to that the way they did that ministry, 10 years ago and thinking, I'm still the same person. Somebody said, we were doing the photos this morning, I said, oh no, he showed us a picture, I'm like, that's my mother. That is my mother in that picture, So that, helping that process of, so if it is ministry, and that is integral, because we all need a reason to get up every morning. I mean, we can sustain the body, but if we don't sustain the spirit, we've all failed. And so thinking about, well, what does ministry really mean, and how do we bring that, if that's so important, how do you create those opportunities where you are today, and that can evolve as your needs change. So thinking and asking that in ways to get to the deeper piece. And then the collective conversations. So this is really, as you're gathered as a community of what are those collective conversations. So from, I think of a community we're just with, okay, there's a piece, a group, a subset that hold on and they ask the same questions at every meeting. You know, they have gone through, I mean, we do a process, you ask, we answer. We've answered the same question probably 12 times, you know, and so that is, they're stuck, and how, you know, that it goes back to how do we look at that? Or the collective attitudes of we should do this or that. So that's the part of, if the individual work isn't done, it's hard to do the collective. And the challenge is there's a pressing need to do the collective, the congregational community work, and how do you balance that? Because this individual piece of coaching and bringing people along have to happen simultaneously. And it's just a huge undertaking to make that happen. And really that embracing. So instead of doing for them, so, you know, that reality, well, you are, you know, going to do this, well, then have you looked at this, this, and this? Because again, that idea of somebody, I want to be independent, but then somebody's going to do all this other stuff for me. So looking at and empowering the individuals to also answer those questions and do that for themselves. So, you know, really aspirational. It has to be multi-generational. I think one of the really inspiring things that we're seeing now is taking these challenges and having, looking at them beyond our lens. So having this cohesive group of people saying, how do we address this, who are, you know, the same ethnicity, same age, background, you know, same lived experiences, education, and how do we really look at that in a broader context to say, how would other people look at this? So, I mean, there was just a design and a challenge on accessible housing, and I did this a number of years ago. The National Association of Home Builders, they had a competition. It was interdisciplinary. It was architects, designers, PT, OT. So it was through, they created these teams, and there were students, and looking at the housing of the future. So there was just this competition. A 13-year-old came up with ideas of really housing across, you know, really housing across the lifespan. So it's not just, this is for seniors, this is just good housing, and what her perspective was. And so thinking about that in a broader context of that. And then really, how do we start to eliminate those negative stories? So I learned, and I say this over and over, in religious life, the definition of community is however many members there are, is that many definitions of community. And if you try to change something, it even gets bigger of what community is. And so, and that community is used, it is really, you know, one of those words that is often overused that really, in some ways, lacks meaning. Because people can say, well, I want to live in community, but is there really community in that living? I mean, I think of, you know, years ago when there were still a lot of big mother house infirmaries, that while everybody was under the same roof, there was a very limited number of sisters who actually went down the hallway to visit the sisters in the infirmary. Oh, but if you were going to sell that mother house, you know, that this is our home, this is community where we all support each other. And so that piece of what is community, and then it is really the tension that goes back to, I want to do, you know, I want to be here, I want to stay here, I want, you know, it's all my ministry, not our charism. And so that's really that tension. And, you know, for the younger sisters, you know, their call to religious life was not necessarily to be caregivers and do everything else. But that multi-generational piece, and I think thinking about that even of living is that, for most of our life, we live in multi-generational communities, and how do we think about it that way? And how do we engage the power of youth who have much different perspectives on thinking about this? So, part of the whole coaching piece is thinking about how, as we age, can we become trailblazers? And can we shift kind of that under that stigma? So that stigma of, and I think most people think, even though very few Americans live in nursing homes, most people think that is where, they are going to send me. They are going to send me to that bad nursing home. And that, how do we really, again, think about the transformative energy for full presence and look at it holistically. So really part of the coaching and then the vital living is thinking about it with passion, with wisdom, thinking about it financially, spiritually, being conscious about aging, time, mortality, death, rebirth. So thinking about it in that holistic and trying to use that to generate transformative energy. So what's the greatest fear? And I think is that fear of, our own fears. And again, as much as the 3 words, probably if we said, what are your 3 fears about aging, some would be the same, like I don't want to be in a nursing home, I hear all the time. But that, what are those, that what's underlying that is a different thing. That's the physical manifestation of a building, that it's getting, again, deeper of what are those fears. And the subsequent resistance, thinking about what can be possible. And that truth, and if you think about liberation theology and about whole pieces of community, and again I think that broader context, and I think about, again, as we see in other countries that have aged, of really reframing community and looking at it in a much bigger aspect, and being intentional. And again, that experience of just thinking about space and how it is used in everyday instances and interactions is thinking about that for, again, all ages, not just old age. So Mark Nebo, that's who we used, his reflection from the prayer. If any of you have looked at any of his work, but he has a great book. His latest book is called More Together Than Alone, and it's about communities. And we will have, he has a whole reflective guide that we'll have post after today that you can use as a resource of bringing small groups together for conversations. And there's some great content in there of community. But thinking about that of how are we more together? And so we talked about isolation. We talked about different paths, about the individual discernment. And if, he uses, talks about, in African culture, so many people, Richard Leiter, who's also a pioneer and an innovator in aging and a coach, and has done a lot with coaching, is really talks about, those sacred circles of, and going to working with indigenous people and looking at that, I am because you are And because you are, I am. And that whole part about the aspen and their underlying roots, and thinking about it together. So, that really is kind of, the hope is really that gift of communion. And part of communion is that meeting each person where they are so we can fully develop that. Questions?
I think I'm having sort of a kind of difficult time sort of figuring out, yes, I see the needs of the whole, the community, but I guess I don't really quite see where the autonomy and the individuality, I'm not getting like where that fits in.
Well, so the question about the community needs and then autonomy and individuality.
Right.
So it's really both and, right? Because you want, while we look at sustaining your resources, the most precious is your human resource,
Right.
so the individual. And so part of that is what we know one of the struggles is that it's that intersection of what the congregation needs to do and the individual. And if we don't do the individual piece to bring them along, it often is that it's a tension because the individuals are still going to resist. I mean, it's the same, it's that part with humans of if we don't bring them along, that I want to stay in my house till I rot because I don't, I'm fiercely independent. I don't need anybody's help, but I really do. And so that really is with meeting them where they are and trying to work on this, not only with services, but with that outside resource in helping on the coaching and bringing them along is a key piece. Because again, we can do education, we can do, have one-on-one, small group, but they need more than that. It needs to really get to the personal side. And I think without that, it's hard because we haven't gone deeper to really make it successful. We're still saying that, it goes back to, we kind of, when Stuart was saying about, here's this plan, it's like, we kind of as a congregation created our plan and, this is what you're going to do, and that there's still that tension there. And so it's looking at and with thinking about this from that overlaying this in your plan of kind of that coaching resource, doing the individual pieces. First of all, as an outside resource, I think what it does do is people are a lot willing to tell an outsider oftentimes. And so I know that, even a decade ago when we looked at congregations that had sisters in healthcare coordinator roles or lay people, part of it is a whole thing of building the trust. But oftentimes they were willing to tell a non-sister or a even the men who had lay people, that they were willing to tell somebody else, what they wouldn't, tell their own. Because there's also, if I share this, what's private and what's going to lead, if I tell you this, are you calling leadership and reporting this on me, and then you're going to take my car, or you're going to tell me I have to move? So it's creating that, environment where people can feel that they can be honest, and what can be kept in confidence, and what's that balance between that need and the need for privacy and the need for keeping people safe and providing. So it's a delicate balance, but that having them go together is really an important piece of it. So I think this is where, if you look at how do you create a program with a partnership that marries both from the beginning? Because you have to, in the one-on-ones, there has to be a trust created in order for people to share. So you need to know me before you're going to tell me, or else you're just, I'm just you're just falling out of form. And so part of that is in that relationship, you can learn a lot. You can probably learn a lot more than what you're going to be checked off on an assessment form that, so ask that. And most of them for enrollment in programs are, a lot of them are straight, depending on the program, but they're pretty straight kind of health questions. And I have when we worked with the Dominicans, I will never forget when, the sister, where she is walking down the hallway at the mother house, carrying her walker up like this, up in the air, and saying, I am independent. Then, I don't know, 9 years ago, my husband had bilateral knee replacement, and he's like walking down the hall with the walker and saying, I don't need this anymore. I was like, oh, my lives are crossing now, my personal life and my professional. But that piece of, so they have to go together and happen really simultaneously. The hardest part is finding the partners who are willing to do that, or if a program doesn't have that, how can you resource and integrate those two? And so that's really the challenge on that. So you've heard this, you could fill in the blank on, I want to stay, I have to stay, I must stay in my ministry. These people need me, well, so that's really on that coaching piece of, first of all, helping them work through that. Well, what if something happened to you? Again, health crises are age agnostic, right? They can happen at any time. And so that, well, what would happen? Have you thought about this? Is it, if you look at, lifespan and transitioning of ministries, has there been a plan in place? If everything is dependent on you, then the deeper dialogue of how's this going to continue is if something happens to you, that it's not, or where I'm living or that. But the part about that is where that deeper piece has to happen, because there are only certain choices, is if that's what you want, then you really have to have a plan. And you have to be looking at, that's what I want. So then as things happen, if you can't drive, you can't think these other sisters or, these friends of yours or whoever is going to be are going to drive unless that has all been worked out. So if you want choice, and that's really what's most important, is then how do you create a plan that can support that for as long as possible till that's not safe. If you resist it, well, then you did make a choice, and the choice will be, and it goes back to the book about, aging in the right place, is that then you've passed that choice, and the choice will, unfortunately, then it all then it's somebody says, or you have a health crisis, you go to the hospital, and the discharge planner says she can't go back home, or leadership, and then leadership, has to, or somebody else says the sister isn't safe and leadership has to make that choice and they need to go to a nursing home or wherever that may be. The part about this is engaging the person in the dialogue. So while there are certain choices and it's not unlimited, is helping them through that conversation of, if this is important to me, then how does that happen? And so that again, whatever it is, but that you really look at, for any of us, there's limited opportunities. So if we don't have unlimited financial means to just, pay for all these people to support this, then these are the ways, but it's bringing the individual along through that introspective process to understand it deeper in their personal context. Because if it's, okay, these are the, they don't like none of us like being told, and then that's where they're gonna, the resistance piece is huge. And that reality is a reality of every family. I mean, everybody, all of my friends who have parents who are alive are all dealing with this in certain aspects. And everybody, we all have to make that choice of, can you caregive at a distance? Is one person gonna, so that's really a reality of everybody and not just, women religious. And again, that individual part of how do we look through, how do we do this? So part of this is taking care of sisters. I mean, because first of all, doing nothing, is a crisis. It's a crisis for multiple crises waiting to happen. That, the we is really the reality of who's the we, because, I think of a congregation, they have 250 members still, they can't get 3 sisters to volunteer to go to the nursing home once a month to just, organize the sister's closet and dresser to help with that. So that we piece, and it is the deeper, so we, but I'm too busy in my ministry, so we is somebody else, and so that piece, and the we is looking at who is that, and to care. And I think that the reality, if we looked at the research from the beginning, and this is a great transition to David, because I think from the PACE program, is that, so you are doing this and doing the planning because you want to take care, I mean, fundamentally, you want the best for every single sister, just like family. The reality is there are constraints to do that, and that has to be a part of those conversations.